Do you guys remember that movie that came out in the early 2010s? It was this kind of an action thriller where an underdog, lower-class protagonist finds his way into a spy organization led by Michael Caine, and he becomes a spy, and it's this weird, hyper-violent film that no one saw coming. You know, Cars 2.
The first sign of the morning light, old glory's in the sky.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that no one cares about the Cars franchise. And there isn't really a reason to. I mean, the first one wasn't bad, but it was definitely the worst Pixar film at the time of its release. As far as Rotten Tomatoes scores go, there was a drop from a 97% for The Incredibles to a mediocre 74%, and Pixar hadn't scored below a 92 at the time. Pixar has been an industry leader since its formation. It produced the first fully computer-generated animated movie, and that's pretty huge. So maybe it was the high standards that made Cars feel so lackluster. The conflict isn't as high as The Incredibles, the emotion isn't as deep as Finding Nemo, and its ensemble isn't as memorable as Toy Story. The only names I can remember off the top of my head are Lightning and Mater, and they're hardly an iconic enough duo to make up the big two of the movie.
Across the pond it's afternoon and the Union Jack flies high.
Cars follows a formula a lot of Pixar movies do, which I like to call the big two. These movies have two main characters, character A, who are with from the very beginning, and character B, who are introduced to later, and often in a situation where they're a direct threat to character A's world. We may come to sympathize with character B and like them just as much as character A, but regardless, they're introduced to us after we've established the perspective of character A and are ourselves situated in it. We relate to the first character and come to accept the second character as they do. Pretty much every Pixar movie is dependent on the relationship between two key characters. Woody and Buzz, Marlin and Dory, Carl and Russell, Joy and Sadness. These characters make or break the plot. It's pretty much always by having these characters specifically work together that the film's conflict is resolved. And while we take on the perspective of character A, Woody, Marlin and Joy, the plot can't progress without the action of character B, Buzz, Dory, Sadness. Thus, the dynamic of the characters is central to a Pixar film. So if that dynamic isn't compelling, you don't have a very strong foundation for a successful story.
We're on our first cup of coffee. We're on our third cup of tea.
The plot of Cars isn't anything revolutionary. Spoiled celebrity city boy finds himself in a small town and is forced to adjust to the pace of it, finds out he likes it, makes some unlikely new friends, and learns compassion along the way. We've seen it before. But I don't think that's why it's not an interesting movie. I think the biggest failure structurally in Cars is that the big two of this movie, Lightning and Mater, don't have a dynamic that holds sway over the plot. Their relationship doesn't actually matter in the story, and that's pretty important if you're going to use that dynamic for future stories. I think the best way I can explain this is by comparing Finding Dory with Cars 2. In Finding Nemo, we meet Marlin, an overprotective father who's lost his child, and Dory, a fish with short-term memory loss who's looking for long-term acceptance. Both of these characters are looking for a family of some sort, and their journeys are both equally important. While Finding Nemo is our primary concern, we care about what happens to Dory at the end of the film, and while it's Marlin that motivates the journey to find Nemo, it's Dory's spontaneity that gets him anywhere. And beyond that, we see her making personal victories throughout the story. She's the one who really progresses the plot, so we're just as invested in her story by the end. So, when we see a sequel about Dory, it's interesting. Finding Dory makes sense. We were already invested in her story, we want to see more of her journey because she had a journey to begin with. Mater doesn't do anything in Cars? If you look at the Wikipedia plot for Cars, as I'm sure you have, you will see his name mentioned once. In brackets. Here are the things Mater does in Cars. He takes Lightning cow tipping. So I was reasonably confused when I found out that Cars 2 was about Mater. I looked into the development process of Cars 2 thinking, oh, maybe they wanted to do a story about Doc Hudson, you know, the only other character they kind of developed in the movie. But they couldn't do it after Paul Newman died. But no, Lasseter always wanted the movie to be about Mater. But he did nothing to make us interested in Mater. No backstory, no motivations, no impact on the story. He's just there to provide punchlines as the goofy redneck friend. He doesn't have a journey and he doesn't grow throughout the film. This is the first failure of Cars 2. It focuses on a character we have no reason to be interested in.
Abbey Road, Route 66, CIA to the MI6.
So I'm gonna go ahead and assume that no one watching this right now has seen Cars 2. So you may have been surprised when I called it a hyper-violent spy film, but that's what it is. The film opens as follows. Michael Caine is grabbing a ride on a crab boat to a distant location where some sort of nefarious action is taking place. We don't know much about Michael Caine, but we know he's a spy, and he's looking for his fellow agent in some sort of rescue mission. While trying to catch the baddies, he realizes that his fellow agent has been crushed and cubed. A chase scene ensues in which Michael Caine pulls out guns, this car has guns in it, and uses them to shoot down some oil barrels and effectively blow up the hideout, destroying a bunch of cars in the process. Now, something very important to keep in mind here. Pixar works with non-human characters a lot. Toys, ants, fish, rats, whatever. But it makes them relatable to us by giving them human emotion and relatable goals. Even if their situations are fantastical, we're meant to relate to their wants and their motivations. What makes their stories compelling is our ability to equate their feelings and their desires with our own, and in doing that, they're humanized. Jessie isn't a toy, she's someone who's been abandoned and is scared of trusting people. Remy isn't a rat, he's someone who wants equal opportunity to explore his dreams. And while we could read a lot into all of these films and their individual implications, they're collectively rooted in the fact that non-human protagonists are humanized insofar as they act in human ways with human motivations. So just for the hell of it, let's look at that opening scene again as if it had human protagonists. Michael Caine is grabbing a ride on a crab boat to a distant location where some sort of nefarious action is taking place. Okay, not so bad. We don't know much about Michael Caine, but we know he's a spy and he's looking for his fellow agent in some sort of rescue mission. A little intense, maybe. Things are escalating quickly, but still okay. While trying to catch the baddies, he realizes that his fellow agent has been crushed and cubed. His friend has been crushed and cubed. He is looking at the mutilated body of his dead friend. This is 5 minutes into the movie. A chase scene ensues in which Michael Caine pulls out his semi-automatic car guns and uses them to shoot down some oil barrels and effectively blow up the hideout, destroying a bunch of cars in the process. Michael Caine just killed a ton of people in a rage over the horrifying murder of his friend. Cars 2, everyone. And yeah, there have been dark moments in other Pixar movies, but they tend to happen at the height of the movie with already established protagonists who we're pretty sure are going to be okay. The stakes here are immediately way too high for an audience that is going to be seeing this just because they don't know any better, especially considering they don't know anything about this character. He's just Michael Caine, and his friend is dead, and he's blowing everyone up. And it doesn't stop in that intro scene. A ton of cars are murdered by explosion throughout the film. There are literal torture scenes. There's a car bomb. And at one point it's framed as an assassination attempt against the car queen of England. This all leads to the second major problem in Cars 2. It doesn't target its audience correctly. All these tropes fit into a spy movie, but they're not toned down in any way for kids other than by having non-human protagonists. Had these been human protagonists, this would mess a lot of children up. This film just dives headfirst into a hyper-violent action setting, and while using cars in place of humans saves us from the gore, it doesn't make the concept any less horrifying.
Right lane, left lane, metric, imperial, pounds, dollars, howdy, cheerio.
I didn't go into this thinking I would have to talk about Orientalism, but here we are. So Pixar, believe it or not, is run by a bunch of old white men. I know. Crazy. And it's films like this where that really shows.
What happened to the dinosaurs now?
The B-plot of this movie is that Lightning McQueen is competing in a bunch of races in places that aren't the southern United States. And when you go into that plot with only the perspective of old white men, there's a good chance that your take on it isn't going to be, oh, okay, we can explore different cultures and see how these different characters interact and learn from each other and maybe introduce some cars of color, I don't know. But in this case, it's more along the lines of, whoa, look how weird Japan is, you guys. Half the humor of this movie is dependent on racial stereotypes. This is our first look at Japan in the Cars universe. Immediately, everything is a caricature, and oh, what do you know, we have a little casual appropriation. And you may think, well, Mater's the goofy comic relief. He's not meant to be taken seriously, so it's fine if he's appropriating because he doesn't know what he's doing, which in itself is problematic because he's coded lower class, and having him be the incompetent character isn't exactly a neutral choice. But that's exactly the problem. The writers of this film picked Japan as a setting without taking it seriously. It isn't used as a setting to tell a Japanese story, it's used as something to counter Mater's understanding of the world. It exists here only to be foreign. And that leads to scenes like this. And this.
Hey! You done good. You got all the leads.
And, oh god, that was an actual design choice made by a team of people for a 2011 film. None of the plot actually revolves around Japan. It's used entirely to humiliate Mater because it's different and hard for him to understand. Asian culture is shown as a caricature meant to be exaggerated to act in opposition to the normal white culture. The only other culture that's introduced that isn't really othered in this film is British culture. Mater is predominantly working with British characters, and at no point is there some big comedic scene where Mater doesn't know how to pour tea or something. Beyond some poor dialogue, there's no reliance on stereotyping. We even get this fun song about how Americans and Britons aren't so different after all.
V8 ground to a V12 screen. Hail to the chief. Well, God save the queen. Cops, bobbies, Tabasco, wasabi.
No, wasabi.
Oh, same old, same old. What's up with you?
That's problem number 3 of this movie. It uses other cultures as a punchline rather than for plot, and in doing so, it perpetuates a bunch of stereotypes and continues years of racist portrayals.
You're a good old boy. Well, you're a decent bloke.
This is the part of the video where I talk about the patriarchy. Hi, Crescenda. No matter how awful the movie, Disney is gonna go hard on putting out merchandise for it, and the marketing of these toys is dependent on the gender binary. The gender binary creates a clear division between male and female attributes and determines acceptable behavior based on these boundaries. Being a binary, it presents only 2 acceptable options, and in doing so, places them in opposition to each other. Because if you're not one, you're the other. So young girls are marketed heroines and toys who are nurturing and passive, and boys are marketed heroes and toys who are rowdy and active. And those are the roles that they will seek in their lives because that's what they know is attainable to them. Before the acquisition of Marvel and Lucasfilm, Disney wasn't putting out a ton of toys that were marketed to boys because they didn't have a ton of franchises suited for the job. When Disney's main holdings were Disney and Pixar, their most profitable toys were Disney princesses. Now, girls have long been given idols that are pretty and often passive, but at the very least, they were given a wide range of princesses. Princesses who have individual stories and may actually motivate their own stories, and who provide actual cultural representation for young girls looking for role models. Not this. And boys were given cars. And in being given cars, boys were shown that their ideal was supposed to be this violent, action-driven lead. By making Cars the franchise for boys, Disney is furthering the placement of male characters in active and often violent roles. And that problem still persists in the era of Marvel and Lucasfilm merchandising. Toys marketed to boys stem from franchises that thrive on violence. And when their only role models are rooted in violence, there's a good chance that their behavior will begin to follow the same path. But you're not a little boy who doesn't have agency in his consumption. So why should you care?
We ain't so different, you and me.
Any media that we consume has an impact on us in some way. But when we're young, media is partially responsible for developing how we see the world. In a lot of instances, it introduces new concepts to us. Media consumption is part of everyone's lives all the time, especially now when the number of screens we're exposed to daily is rapidly expanding. And we can't deny the importance of what we see on those screens, especially for children who have little control over what it is they're watching, and little critical capacity to understand it with. And this is where phrases like, "it's just a kids movie" are so frustrating. Because on the one hand, there can be really good kids movies by adult standards. Multiple movies produced for kids have been nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. Calling them just kids movies ignores their importance in childhood development, and it perpetuates the idea that there isn't value for adults in seeing them and hearing their messages. But on the other hand, Cars 2. If we accept that media consumption has influence over us, and especially over developing minds, we have to acknowledge that garbage movies like this are still capable of having a huge impact. For little kids, this may be the first time that they see a portrayal of Japanese culture, and their understanding of it very well could be, "Whoa, look how weird Japan is." Because when culture is used as a comedic backdrop, as it is in this movie, that's how it comes to be understood. It was a critical failure, and it wasn't a smash hit at the box office. But that didn't stop the production of a third Cars movie, a couple of spin-off films, and endless merchandise, because Disney knows that cars and violence are what's desirable for young boys, and it's not looking to change the status quo. This franchise only serves to maintain the power of old white men by glorifying hyper-violent behavior as the masculine ideal, thus enforcing gender binaries and using non-white culture as a comedic backdrop, thus delegitimizing actual representation. And it may be hard to believe that Cars 2, this garbage movie, is capable of doing that. But media directed towards kids can't be brushed aside as it has been for so long, because it's going to have an impact on their perspectives as they come to understand the world. Ideologies are formed by what we consume, so we have to be questioning what messages are placed in the most vulnerable minds. And I think movies like Cars 2 really just drive the point home.
In this collision of worlds.